And hello, welcome to the Social Justice Forum. I am your host, Daren Jaime. We thank you for joining us. Now, if you're asking the question, what is this show about? We bring you a forum discussing and providing a deeper understanding of the issues and inequities that so many communities face. Things such as systemic inequalities to pressing social problems. Our guests provide multiple perspectives and insights, helping us better understand and address these challenges. So we invite you to stay connected to us as the Social Justice Forum starts now. And welcome back. In a world where thousands of youth embark on harrowing journeys across Central America and Mexico, the struggle for a better future often comes with unimaginable challenges. Drawing from extensive research and firsthand narratives of migrant youth in Los Angeles, our next guest explores the critical questions surrounding their experiences. Joining us is the leading immigration expert and author of Sin Padre Nin Papeles, Stephanie L. Canizales, and we thank you, Stephanie, for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And so when we talk about this issue, obviously you're an expert, and we want to definitely pick your brain a little bit to give us a little bit more that we could really talk about here. We hear a lot across America, migration statistics, the fact of how migration is impacting the United States. Let's just break it down from your perspective, and I'll ask you, when we look at migration and the migrant crisis, how do you view it?
I view it as a legacy of US intervention in the countries where people are originating from. I study Central American and Mexican youth migration specifically. We can look back decades and see that youth migration falls on the sort of tails of young adult men who migrated, single men to work in the US, followed by women, then families, and now we're at a stage where children are migrating alone to make up for the economic losses, the political repression, the violence that they're facing in their communities, in their countries of origin. And we can tie those conditions to US policies, US economic integration in the countries where children are migrating from.
And when we look at migration, obviously there's a couple of questions that we have, and there's a couple of questions that you maybe asked too. Separating children, right, or children being separated. Why do we talk about children being separated from their parents at the border without understanding why they come here in the first place?
Yeah, children are migrating on their own, right? Without parents, children are migrating with aunts, uncles, cousins. Children are also migrating as parts of a family unit, and then they become unaccompanied from their parents or caregivers at the border because of US immigration policy. We say that it is to protect children from potential trafficking. We say that it's to protect children from the potential of coming into the US with someone other than a parent or biological caregiver. Uh, all of those conditions, of course, can be true, but history shows and the research shows that this isn't the majority of the case. And young people are sort of collateral damage to any sort of deterrence policies, efforts that we make to make migration unappealing, to make life in the US unappealing. Again, kids fall as collateral damage as they're being made unaccompanied children.
Yeah, and Stephanie, I think we do a lot of damage simply by just looking at the pictures that we see, reading statistics that hit the screen, and there's so much more to just the what we're seeing across the screen and the statistics that we read. Putting a name to a face, putting some
Mhm.
reality there. You've been behind the scenes. Uh, Take us there.
Yeah, so my book, Sin Padres ni Papeles, is translates to Without Parents Nor Papers. It is a study of 6 years that I spent in Los Angeles with unaccompanied young adults and teenagers who had all arrived in the US between the ages of 7, 10, 11, and 17, right? Really young children who came to the US as unaccompanied and undocumented young people. I love your framing, right? We hear these numbers 11 million undocumented people or 750,000 unaccompanied children. But as much as it is that very large, overwhelming number, it is also the one kid that I introduce in the introduction of the book, Christian, or Caleb, who really ushered me into what it means to be an undocumented, unaccompanied young person. They grow up as low wage workers in factories, sewing for J. Crew or Banana Republic, Old Navy. They grow up as dishwashers in our favorite restaurants across Los Angeles, as hotel janitors and domestic workers and nannies in private homes. These are young people who are coming to the US to make up again for the futures that they don't see in their origin countries, and really looking for an opportunity not just to get by, but to get ahead. And as I explain in the book, not just as immigrants, but as adolescents, as young people who are trying to imagine futures as adults and as people who can participate in their society. And that's something I think we can all empathize with, because we've all been teenagers, we've all been adolescents striving to be a version of ourselves in the future.
As you did your research for your book, I wonder what were some of the key takeaways that you found that maybe defied your expectations?
Yeah, some of the things I found that were really interesting to me as a human, but also as a sociologist, right? One, that unaccompanied children are not just migrating because parents are sending them off or because children are running away from something. There were so many people that I talked to who talked in very detailed words about the mindful, methodical decisions that they made to migrate for themselves and for their own well-being, but also to support their families. They talked about wanting to end the suffering that they saw their mothers enduring, their fathers, their grandparents, but also wanting their siblings to have a future in education or in employment stability in the origin country so they wouldn't have to migrate unaccompanied. So, this idea that migrants make individual decisions to get ahead is just not true. And then the other side of that, once in the US, I was really surprised to find that when organizations, when institutions, when adults in the room let children down, they often had each other's back, right? They became each other's resources, and anyone that got any sort of insight into how to navigate a workplace or find an apartment or even just make friends was very quick to share that information with someone younger than them or someone who was more recently arrived. And youth created their own culture of care and their own networks of support in the US context in the absence of us doing that work for them.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about your research because you do ask some interesting questions. I think it's one question that's worth asking that I'm going to ask you. And one of the things that you ask is why are the people that are commenting on the plight of Latinos, rarely researchers?
Why are the people that are commenting on them
Yeah.
rarely those folks? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I think
we
it begs to light the question like, okay, if you're getting your numbers and you're getting your statistics, how about we talk to those who are in the trenches?
yeah. I think that's one of the main issues I bring up in the book, right? If we want to solve the unaccompanied minor crisis in the US, if we want to know what's happening at the border and how to solve the border crisis, we have to ask the people that are there. We often have this sort of top down perspective on a lot of issues, not just migration, but folks that think they know how it should be and don't, as you're suggesting, know how it is, like on the ground, often have a lot of opinions on what people should or shouldn't be doing. And in that sense, we end up criminalizing, villainizing, pathologizing, right? Like making the people the problem and not really looking at the structure. So when you talk to young people on the ground, when you hear their voices, and Sin Padres ni Papeles really tries to draw on the terms that young people use, right? I don't come up with this sociological framework out of nowhere, but it's really borrowing from the language of the teenagers and young adults themselves and asking, what was the reason for your migration? What was it like to arrive initially, and how do you feel now, 10 years later? And I think when we come up with those conversations and we really understand crises from the perspective of the people experiencing them, we come away with more empathy and understanding. And that's what I was saying earlier, right? Coming away with an understanding of care, which is not something that I really went into the work expecting to find.
Yeah. As you did your research, what was your methodology and what was your approach?
Yeah, I'm an ethnographer. I spend a lot of time in community. I just watch people and maybe that's part of my middle child syndrome where I was just like, what is everyone doing at all times in my family? But I spend time in community. I got to know a support group of young people. Again, informally, young people started their own group. It was about 15 to 30 people on any given Friday night, all unaccompanied, undocumented factory workers in downtown Los Angeles. I spent 7 months just kind of hanging out with them before anyone accepted to do an interview. I conducted 75 interviews total, all with young people who migrated as unaccompanied children, again, between about 11 and 17. And then, yeah, 6 years just going to churches, hanging out at donut shops, coffee shops, sandwich shops, any shop basically, hanging out at birthday parties and dinners, and really trying to get a sense of what does it mean? What does it look like? And how does it feel? Not that I would ever truly embody that feeling, but when you hang out enough, you sort of pick up on the threads, right, of how people experience a certain social location, the place that they occupy in society. And I was very grateful that these people trusted me enough to let me hang out, even as far as vigils and funerals of loved ones and of some of the young people that I'd come to know in the field also.
I want to ask the question about as you've taken this time in depth in the trenches, spending time. Then you look and you hear, a whole lot of policy that's being crafted from people who've never been. Uh, I call it supposition, hypothesis, all these things that are being thrown out there in order to make the migration argument. From your perspective, where are we getting it wrong when it comes to the migration argument with regards to policy that maybe we don't know because we just don't have the boots on the ground?
Yeah, one of the things that I see, just based on my own work, is that we misunderstand a lot of the time the meaning of childhood. Maybe not in the US context, but in the origin country. And I see that a lot in conversations around migrant child labor, which is on the rise, right? 318% increase in child labor violations um, over the last decade. And part of what I see is an issue in our approach to addressing that crisis, the child labor crisis, is that we misunderstand what it means to be a child in the origin countries where people are coming from. In my interviewees, among my interviewees, there was someone who started working as a shoe shiner in Guatemala as young as 3 years old, and he was very aware of what he was doing to support himself, his sister, and his mother. And he comes to the US context as a 14-year-old and he starts working here. And that isn't anything different from what that person has lived or the sort of framework that that person understands their social role and their everyday responsibilities from. But it is a deviation from Western normative or US ideas of childhood. So then we come into the picture, we design policies that reward people for following a trajectory of childhood. And in the immigration world, we can think of the DREAM Act or DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that was sort of based on this idea that a child who grew up in US schools, who experienced Americanness by everything but their legal status, is deserving of protection. But what does that mean for a young person who got here at 9 years old, who began working because that's what they knew and that's what they had to do? And they very much are productive in the sense of their own meaning of productivity and survival, but they don't meet that criteria of childhood, or they don't meet that sort of the milestones of proving their worthiness of legal protection. So again, when we sort of come into a situation from the top down and we impose our frameworks on a crisis, we miss the lived experience. And when we ask young people, well, why are you working at the age of 9 as a dishwasher in a restaurant in the US? And they say, well, I've been doing this work since I was 4, that is their framework. And we should design policies in ways that reflect the human experience, not the human expectation of what is good.
I want to get, before we wrap up our segment, the opportunity for you to talk about the role of community support and how that plays out.
Yeah, community support was perhaps the most important factor in the outcomes that I observed among young people. I explained two separate trajectories of unaccompanied, undocumented youth workers in the US, one that sort of ends, as I observed it, in a place of adaptation, adjustment to life in the US, and another one that ends at a place of perdition, which doesn't translate beautifully, but perdición in the Spanish language is a loss, an angst, a loss of self, and a loss of one's future, and the goals that you set for yourself. So the difference between experiencing adaptation and perdition for unaccompanied young people was that community support, meaningful social ties that allowed unaccompanied young people, so kids who are growing up without their parents, without an adult caregiver in the room, meaningful social ties that allowed them to feel witnessed is one thing that they describe. The witnessing, the good job, I see what you're doing, I admire the work that you're doing, which again young people often provided for themselves over time, but also a place of desahogo, of unburdening, of venting. It's something we sort of take for granted when we grow up in families. Our parents are people, our siblings are people we vent to as children and talk about our days and our troubles. Young people don't have that when they're on their own. So, a place where they can unburden from their emotional pains, their material worries, those became really important to deciphering who ended up feeling adapted or adjusted, who ended up feeling perdition or a state of loss once in the US. So, anyone who can join a community where migrant children are being served, I encourage you to be a witness or to be a place of this ahogo of unburdening. And that makes all the difference for young people.
And so, for people who want to find out more about your book and the work that you have going on, please share with us how.
Yeah, everything I do, pretty much everything I do, can be found on stephaniecanizales.com. You can pick up the book on Amazon. And if you like what you read, I really hope that you will leave a review.
And the truth is that you've spent a lot of time out in the migration field dealing with immigration. And as we talk about this, and it becomes a hotbed political issue. Do you feel as though that, and I don't want to make it too political, but do you feel as though that the candidates and even those who are in Washington simply just don't get it?
I think what I'm observing is more like a short-term memory, right? In
Okay.
the last election cycle and the one before, unaccompanied children were, a hot topic. Um, we don't hear anything about migrant children today. We hear more and more the criminalization of Haitian immigrants. It was migrant children 4 years ago, 8 years ago, as the deviant potential gang affiliated young person. So, what I wish I would see more of is a sort of full circle conversation about, if you're going to talk about something as a problem, can you provide a solution as opposed to just continually pointing out these hypothetical, straight up untrue, problems about new migrant populations and vilifying one group in one election cycle, then another group in another election cycle. So I wish there was a little bit more of a memory and a sort of loop closing effort. So that we aren't just left with this resentment towards immigrant groups as we are seeing across every single election cycle for as long as I can remember.
Yeah, a lot to pay attention to, and certainly got to have you back. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Dr. Stephanie L. Canizales, who is a leading immigration expert and the author of Sin Padres ni Papeles. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All righty, we are taking a quick break, but guess what? We'll be back right after this. And welcome back. In a city where the fight for safe and stable housing is increasingly urgent, a new report titled A Crisis Compounded, the dual crises of domestic violence and homelessness. It exposes the harsh realities faced by survivors of domestic violence seeking affordable housing. Now, the findings reveal domestic violence is a leading cause of family homelessness, even surpassing evictions. Joining me now and sharing more is the Director of Policy and Communications at New Destiny Housing, Gabriela Sandoval Requena, and we thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Daren.
Two words when we talk about domestic violence and homelessness. Doesn't seem like they go together, but the fact is they do.
Absolutely. And that is exactly the purpose of our recent report, A Crisis Compounded. We wanted to document and showcase the barriers and the hurdles that countless of domestic violence survivors face in New York City and really across the state. If you think about it, if you're in a situation of abuse and perhaps you don't have the social network, you do not have that cousin or that friend or that relative that can put you up in their couch or host you for a little bit while you're escaping a situation of abuse, chances are is that your only choice other than staying with your perpetrator is going to be to enter the shelter system. New York City has the largest shelter system for domestic violence survivors in the country, and it is constantly at capacity. So people trying to get in the shelter to try to make things work for them and their children. But also we've seen that the Department of Homeless Services shelter system, that's the bigger system in the city, that one also has a large number of, especially families with children who are entering that system because of domestic violence.
And what the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness, it crosses in so many, in so many households. How prevalent are we seeing this?
So domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It can really happen to anyone who is in a relationship. It could happen also between. It's not always a partner, an intimate partner dynamic, right? Power and control can be exerted from a child to their parents or their parents towards the children. But we see it happen across all demographics, all layers of the population. But what we do see is that families of individuals of color, especially those who are female, especially those who are Black or identify as Hispanic, those are the ones that make up the majority of the population in the domestic violence shelter system. In 2022, 97% of heads of households in the domestic violence shelter system identified as women, and about 93% identified as either Black or Hispanic.
And as we look at those numbers are, uh, pretty much, what we've heard recently. And I want to talk about what we're hearing because when we hear about these numbers, we hear about the effects, and the effects are not just with these, but this also goes down to children. And I want to take the moment just to really break down a little bit about children when it comes to being children in domestic violence shelters. We're seeing more and more children now occupy domestic violence shelters. Correct me if I'm wrong, but these are more children than we've ever seen before.
Yes, there has been an upward trend in terms of population. The largest age group in domestic violence shelter is, in fact, individuals who are under the age of 18, so children, and the largest group within the the broader category are kids who are under the age of 5. And something that I just want to make note of something that you said, Darren, that's about the intergenerational component and aspect of both homelessness and abuse, which is something that we focus on the report, is that children who experience or witness abuse in their home are more likely to either be victims or perpetrators as adults. We see that if a son witnesses her mother being abused by their father, they're 10 times more likely to be abusers when they grow up. Similarly, if a daughter, a girl witnesses violence or is victim of violence in their household, she is 6 times more likely to endure sexual violence when she reaches adulthood. And not only that, but also the homelessness aspect is very much intergenerational. In the largest shelter system in the city, the Department of Homeless Services shelter system, we've seen that 1 in 6 heads of households were in the shelter system themselves when they were children. So, early intervention systems of support, housing especially, are really essential to break the cycle of homelessness and to give kids and parents a chance to thrive, to achieve their dreams, and to break the cycle for good.
Yeah. Gabriela, I do want to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about this report and the survey because in this report and survey, there is some recommendations that are made towards the city and to those who are in the state. And I want to break that down for a moment. You take a moment and unpack that.
Absolutely. So we make 13 recommendations for both the city and the state in our report, and those are within four overarching areas. We really focus on the solution of permanent housing. That is the bread and butter of New Destiny Housing. In those four areas, we focus on expanding out access to housing resources and services in the sense of also making them available to individuals who are usually left out from the resources. You may know that a shelter stay is often required to get some type of rental assistance in New York City. Additionally, if you're an undocumented survivor, there are really very few resources that you can access. So in that category, we really focus on expanding those type of assistance, especially rental assistance programs for all survivors, not just those that have spent some time in the shelter system or those who have, a full household where everyone is a U.S. citizen. The second recommendation or overarching category of recommendations has to do with supportive housing. Supportive housing is permanent, affordable housing that is affordable. So individuals pay 30% of their income in rent, and they have on site services for them. And we've seen that model. Originally, it started as a model that was more geared towards individuals who have chronic conditions, substance abuse issues, or severe mental illness. And since it has evolved to incorporate other populations that are just as vulnerable, including domestic violence survivors. So the city has a program that is that builds and supports funding for this type of housing model, NYC 1515, as does the state. The difference has been that in the city, the eligibility criteria excluded most survivors who wanted to try, who really needed this type of housing because they had to have a diagnosis and they also had to spend at least a year in the shelter system. So that category in our recommendations is about expanding access to this really valuable and cost-effective housing model for domestic violence survivors. Our third category of recommendations has to do with flexible funding or direct cash transfers or assistance for domestic violence survivors. The city, both the city and the state, over the last year have done made tremendous strides to make resources like financial assistance available to domestic violence survivors. Our recommendations for those programs is to increase the funding. Both the city and the state, as I said, have programs, but they're not funded at the right level to meet the need. So we focus in that category to increase, the amount of money that's available to New Yorkers in the city as well as the state. And number four is improving data collection and reporting because simply you cannot address a problem that you're not counting, you're not documenting correctly. So that in that one, we call for the city and the state to improve their methodology of how they capture applications for the shelter system, especially in the city, as well as the exits. We want to know when people are leaving the domestic violence shelter system, where are they going? We know because of research and data that it takes several tries usually for domestic violence survivors to leave a relationship of abuse. They may enter the shelter system once and then return to their abuser who promises that they will not do, anything back to them again. Um, so they leave the shelter to return to them, but chances are that the situation of abuse will likely worsen and they're going to end up back in the shelter system. So, really understanding where survivors are going after they leave the shelter system is important so that we can center on the solutions and get and assess, right, what are the interventions that are working, what is it that the city and the state and the federal government really should also increase investments on.
Uh, that transitional aspect of getting into housing is really critical, and we know that that can be a game changer that can set somebody forward or really set them back. As you assess the transitional housing situation, how do you see it from your lens?
Well, we see the city and the state have both taken major strides over the last few years to assist survivors. We see that the rental assistance programs for both city and state increased the voucher amount. But one thing that happens to most of survivors is that they also endure what's known as financial abuse. And that could be a range of things. That could be that their perpetrator is using their social security number to open credit cards or taking out loans without their consent. Or perhaps if they're working, the abuser is taking complete control of their income and they really never have a say as to how their money, their earnings are utilized. And so this financial abuse has severe, long lasting consequences for survivors where they some of them in some severe cases they have to relearn, right, they have to know how to manage a bank account, they have to work on improving their credit score in other areas. And so having a support system that we see at a New Destiny twofold. We see the need to provide housing navigation assistance, that is assistance in searching an apartment that is affordable or that falls in within the level of affordability that the rental assistance program allows. And then with that, also offering voluntary supportive services that are individualized and that cater to the needs of the survivors, that can help them address that financial abuse, that can help them address the trauma. There is a huge correlation between negative health outcomes and domestic violence. And most of the time, some of the goes undiagnosed. For instance, survivors can endure traumatic brain injury more often than football players, but they often go undiagnosed and therefore untreated. So making sure that survivors have those tools and resources to get diagnosed, to seek services, so that they can regain power and control of their lives and thrive is really important. And as I said before, we see it as this twofold approach, that is with the housing navigation component as well as access to aftercare services or case management that is voluntary.
Yeah. Uh, I'm thinking my last week it was a conversation I had. I had to go back and remember what week it was. But last week I was having a conversation about uh, the process of the shelters being overloaded and the process that we're understanding that you know we can't take anymore. And I had somebody from homeless services with me last week, and the conversation really stemmed around the fact that the numbers are increasing, capacity is diminishing, and we are getting to a breaking point. Agree?
Absolutely. And I think that part of the problem, right, is the lack of affordable housing in New York City. And that affects not just domestic violence survivors, but really anyone that lives in the city who's looking for a safe home, right, that they can afford. And that is one of the key issues. If you're not increasing the outflow of shelter, right, people are staying in the shelter system for longer and longer, then obviously it's going to become a little bit, more difficult to accommodate those who are seeking shelter, who are escaping situations of abuse and that need that support. And I really want to highlight one of the key areas, well, one of the key findings of our report is that our domestic violence shelter system in New York City was really designed decades ago to cater to families with children. And what we've seen is that single survivors who are often members of the LGBTQI plus community, or who may be survivors of sexual abuse, human trafficking, or seniors, they are left out of the domestic violence shelter system because of just the way that the system has been built. That obviously needs to be revised. That is also one of the recommendations we make in our report. And so if and it has really, that has deep consequences, because if a survivor, a single survivor, is not able to access shelter, then they're not going to be able to access rental assistance, right? So they may have to spend more times, if they're lucky enough to have a relative or some sort of social support that can accommodate them when they're trying to get into the shelter system, then they're not going to be able to access rental assistance or supportive housing, or many of the other resources that are available to individuals that are able to make it into the shelter system. So in the report, we talk a lot about mothers, we talk a lot about children, but I just wanted to make that note that it's also single adult survivors who are often the worst off without access to some of these very important resources.
For people who want to find out more information about the survey and tap in, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so the report is available on our website. That's newdestinyhousing.org, O-R-G. And for individuals who are looking for support, right, there may be some listening in to the show. I just wanted to flag that the city does have a 24-hour hotline. That's 1-800-621-4673, where they can call and get a better understanding of services, go through a safety planning procedure, and all of that. And also, a very important resource is the Family Justice Centers. These are hubs of services that are specially designed for domestic violence survivors who are, at any point of their housing or healing journey. There is one Family Justice Center in every borough, and folks can find location and phone numbers by reaching out to 311, or just doing a quick Google search online.
Yeah. Gabriela, it's been great having you. It's a topic of conversation we continue to follow here on the Social Justice Forum, and we definitely have to have you back as a voice. And I much appreciate your input and giving us the much needed tools.
Thank you so much, Daren.
All righty. We are taking a quick break, but guess what? We'll be back with more coming up right after this here on the Social Justice Forum. And we are back. For over a century, Delta Sigma Theta sorority has championed social change, with its Bronx Alumni chapter continuing this legacy through dynamic voter education initiatives. Their social action committee is actively engaging in the Bronx community in the democratic process, from legislative programming to on-the-ground voter registration efforts. Now, by partnering with local schools, they provide in-classroom voter education as well as encourage civic dialogue. Here now, sharing more, we've got the Bronx Alumni chapter at Delta Sigma Theta sorority chair of the Social Action Committee, Jennifer Lackard, and then also high school social studies teacher at Eagle Academy in the Bronx and chapter member Latonya Branch. And thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Good to see you. Jen, I'll start with you. Obviously, A very crucial election on the minds of Americans, but for the sorority itself, an opportunity not just to get civic engagement, but also voter registration too, huh?
Yeah, number one, thank you for having us. This is such an exciting time, exciting time in our democratic process for us, for me to be social action chair, and for the people that are working with us to kind of really press forward on the front lines. This is just exciting for all of us. But for Bronx alumni, it's in our DNA as a sorority to be doing this political activism and really working around social action and increasing civic engagement. And so in the Bronx, we just really want to get the word out. When we looked at the data, it shows that the lowest propensity of voters are in the 18 to 24 demographic. So we've been really trying to think outside of the box because we are living in a generation now and our young people are really focused on information and data now so that they can make decisions almost in real time. So we've had to change the way we get out there and do voter registrations, how we educate everyone, and kind of rally everyone to get out to the polls.
And when you talk about engagement, really, they want the information now. They want to know what's going on now, and really to be able to wrap their heads around it and make an informed decision. What's been the response as you've been walking in this community, talking to 18 to 24-year-olds? Have they been politically aware?
Well, I guess I can speak on that. So ours, especially our students here, but of this demographic that we are centering on, they are aware of the candidates. They are aware of some of the work that they have done recently and in the past, but a lot of them don't feel like they have a voice. And so a lot of them were not inclined to register to vote or to vote if they were already registered. So part of my job has been to inform them of our electoral process and the role that they play in it. And not just in this national election, but all elections on the local and state level. And letting them know that when you guys have part-time jobs, full-time jobs, your taxes pay the salaries of these politicians, and you definitely should have your voice heard, because a lot of the things that a lot of legislation that's passed and so on and so forth, they affect them and their families. And so they should definitely play a role in this process and start practicing their civic duties now, even as teenagers.
And as this conversation is being had with these young people, and obviously you're bringing them to a level of enlightenment in some areas and some things they already know, what's the takeaway? What are you sensing from them after this conversation? Is there a level of, hey, I'm going to do this? And we all know, because sometimes there is this fall off between the time I say I'm going to do it and the time we get to the polls.
I think there's a lot of excitement. They are definitely ready to take a part, and like we said, a lot of them didn't know that they had a role to play in this. And when we tell them, like, it's your vote that counts, it's your vote that had Obama elected in that election. Their vote is very important, and I think there's a lot of excitement around it. And once they become more knowledgeable and they know the role that they play, they definitely want to play a part in it, because they are very aware of the political stance in this country right now. So they definitely want to be a part of it.
And so, Jennifer, would you share a little bit more with me about the initiative really that's out there to really galvanize young people, get them to the polls, and to really have them engaged?
Yeah, so we started it's our V initiative, voter engagement, enrollment, and it's our voter and empowerment. So we wanted to really excite our young people around the importance of voting. And in order to do that, it's not just about getting people to register to vote, but it was also the education piece. And to Latonya's point, we were excited about what we did when we would do registrations. The students would come up to the table and ask questions, and then we realized there's a gap between what they know and really we could register them, and that's great. We would have numbers and metrics to show that we were able to register a large number of people in that population. The trick was, how do we mobilize them so that they find a connection? And to Latonya's point, we had to really think about short and sweet things that are out there that they can get the information to make informed decisions for themselves. And so we came across, there's a 30-minute documentary called Sabotaged and Suppressed. Suppressed and Sabotaged. And it's by Brave New Films. And it's a great film that talks around voter suppression. And we did a classroom push in at Monroe College Monroe University now. That they've they
Yeah.
changed from university recently, so that's exciting. But we were at Monroe University, and we were in the classroom, and we showed the video for 30 minutes. And in the beginning, the students were looking like, why are we here? This makes no connection to kind of voting. This is ridiculous. After it was over, all of the students were like, let me get the voter registration form. Like, I want to actually be a part of this process. I do not, to see the lengths that people went to suppress our vote throughout the country. I want to be a part of that process. And we were able to kind of tap into wherever the students felt the connection. Many of them were very passionate about things like transportation and housing and littering, sanitation, and just making that make sense to them in their real world. Then we started to see the activism come out, that people wanted to be there. So we then registered them, and now we have educated them. So the next piece is like, what do we do to mobilize them? And I have some treats, some of my other sorority members that'll be coming on. But that's the part. They're the fun, the meats and potatoes of how do we empower and mobilize our young people to vote.
And Latonya, before I cut the segment, and I know you got to get back to class, you got some young people to take care of yourself. But listen, let me ask you this question here about the electoral process. Our young people were somewhat uninformed about that, but after spending some time, how do you assess the people that you've come in contact with and their level of understanding the electoral process now?
I think it was a lot of aha moments where it's like, this is how a law is passed. Like years ago, you had I remember it's a PBS documentary on how a bill becomes a law. And it was almost like teaching that within like 2 minutes and showing this is how you get a bill to the Senate floor. This, it has to get voted on. Like a president just doesn't just sign away things. It's like, this is, you take this law, you take this law. It's a whole process. And in order for that process to start, it starts with our vote. It starts by putting those officials that we elect in those offices to represent us. And I think a lot of young people just that part of it, they just were not aware of. Or I even had some of them say, I remember that in government class, but I didn't pay attention to it. And so now it's like putting what they've learned and putting it into the real world and we call it in school like a text to world connection, and making those connections with what they've learned to the reality of it. And I think it's just really important for young people, especially, to know your vote doesn't start on the national level. It definitely starts at the local and state levels, because those are the people who are putting these bills in, listening to the people's voices, putting together the bills and having them vote on it to become a law. And just letting them know, don't stop at this election. Next year, when we have our mayoral races and different council member seats and stuff like that, that they need to become a part of that voting process as well.
Well, I want to let you get back to class. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I think that they have definitely been empowered to make a decision. And thank you for the work that you're doing, Latonya Branch and Jen Lackard with us. I'm going to take a quick break, be back with more. And then coming up, we'll talk about how the Bronx Deltas are mobilizing the community to vote. We'll take a quick break right after this. And welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with the Bronx Alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority chair of the Social Action Committee, Jennifer Lackard. We've also got Senior Manager of Government Relations at Lime, Nicole Yearwood, and the Director of When We All Vote, Beth Lynk, they're going to talk about how Bronx Deltas are actually mobilizing the community to vote. And Jennifer, I do want to bring you back in and share. It's important for people to get to the polls, but if somebody can't get to the polls, that process of early voting is also something that you're tackling.
Yes, we've been driving home a series of messages this cycle. It's not just been one message. It's about encouraging everyone to, number one, see the importance of voting. The value of voting is really important. But then it's also about allowing them and giving them the tools to access other resources available to them, right? So whether that's absentee ballot, whether that's getting to the poll during early voting, we have been trying to make sure that opened up their access and they don't limit themselves. And earlier in the process, in this segment, I talked about our Young People's Initiative, which is really us working with local colleges in the Bronx. There were 5 colleges that we visited during this cycle, which was a short period of time. I think there was all this excitement that came in late August, and then just kind of getting the community to respond to us. And we were able to register over 120 young people to vote. So we were very excited about that because each school was an accomplishment and sort of learning as we go what they need, educating them on early voting sites. There's a different poll site that you may have for your actual election day site. Make sure you pay attention to that. We didn't want to discourage anyone from going, at least making that effort, and then not being able to close the deal. So we were doing a lot of resourcing and making sure the information got out to the people that needed it the most.
Yeah. Nicole, let me talk to you a little bit about the Lime to the Polls initiative. And what is the Lime to a Polls initiative?
Sure. So Lime is a micromobility company, and we're in almost 300 markets globally. And we're excited to actually be a partner with Vote Early Day and When We All Vote, to make sure not only that people get to the polls using our vehicles, but to also make sure that they have a plan to vote. So here in New York City, Line to the Polls is actually, we're offering a promotion, Vote 2024, where people will get a free 30-minute ride to get to and from the poll site. And for voting early, that's imperative because, as you said earlier, Jen, your early voting site is not always the same as your election day site, and they're more spread out in the city. So there are fewer of those, whereas on election day, your poll site is normally within 1 or 2 blocks walking distance of your home.
So, Nicole, let me cut you off here for a second to say that when it comes to getting to the polls, obviously the challenge is on election day. Everybody knows where to go, but early voting, no.
Right, right. So, what I was saying earlier is talking about visiting, find my poll site.vote.nyc is a great resource. Also, on our scooters, you can scan the QR code directly connected to When We All Vote, and you can make a vote plan there. And that will also get you the information you need to find your early voting poll site as well as your election day poll site. In addition to that, the Board of Elections has been sending mail to every registered voter. I received my piece, and it tells you your early voting site, the dates and the times for early voting, as well as giving you a fast pass that you can just scan, and get started, get your ballot, and head out the door. So it makes it really quick.
Yeah.
So I encourage people to always read your mail from the Board of Elections. That's going to tell you all you need to know. And again, that website is findmypollsite.vote.nyc, or you can scan the QR code. Our vehicles are wrapped with When We All Vote, highlighting our partnership, and it will help you make a vote plan.
Yeah. And Beth, let me bring you in here. I mean, you got to be absolutely proud of the fact that this mobilization effort is going forward, and not just the mobilization effort is going forward, but honestly to be able to see the results on the other side with so many people becoming more politically aware and at the same time engaged.
Absolutely. So, when we all vote, we were founded by Mrs. Obama in 2018, and we are on a mission to increase participation in each and every election, to close the race and age voting gap, and to change culture around voting. And we are so honored and excited to be working with organizations like the Bronx Alumni Chapter, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. For me, this one is a personal one, and I'm just so excited to see the great work that's happening on the ground. This activation and outreach is a part of our larger national Parties at the Polls program, where we are bringing community action and celebration together to encourage people to make a plan to vote and then ultimately to vote. Because we know when we make voting joyful, when we make it a celebration, we actually see action. So that's really exciting. The other thing I want to say is that we know, so right now, voter registration deadlines are here and have passed in many states for folks to take that action. But early voting has begun, and this is the real time for folks to ensure that you're making a plan to vote and voting early. Specifically, that looks like, one, when are you voting? Are you going to vote early, or are you going to vote on election day? 2, how are you voting? Are you going to vote by mail? Or are you going to go in person? And 3, who are you voting with? So one of the things we say is build your voting squad. Can you reach out to 3 people to vote with you and to also make a plan alongside you? And bonus points for voting early in that process. So that's really what all of this is about. And we know that partnerships like Lime to the Polls are such helpful tools when we're looking to overcome barriers to voting. We know that there are a number of reasons why people may not vote. That includes not having a ride or a way to get to the polling place. So a partnership like Lime to the Polls allows folks to easily have a way to get to their polling place. We also know sometimes voters may think their vote doesn't matter. So organizations like the Bronx Alumni Chapter reaching out and saying, your vote matters. I'm inviting you to vote. I want to see you vote, and I want to celebrate you for making your voice heard, makes a huge difference. And the last thing we know is folks may not have the details about how to vote. Where is your polling place? Is your early polling place different than your regular polling place? What are the deadlines? So we share a lot of information. You can find out more information at weall.vote/hub, scanning the QR codes on all of those Lime scooters, and reaching out to trusted organizations like Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the Bronx Alumni Chapter to get your questions answered, and then share that accurate information with your community so that we can make sure that no one doesn't vote because they don't know how.
Yeah, Beth, thank you so much for letting us know. And obviously, we will find out in just a short amount of time how many people actually came out to the polls. But the reality is you guys ladies, I should say, will not be guilty of not doing your job of really getting people out there. It's been a pleasure having you all with us, and congratulations on the great work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Glad to have you.
One last shameless plug. Make
Yes.
sure that everyone comes out to our party at the polls on Tuesday, October 29th, which is Vote Early Day at the Sotomayor Center from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. We will be there in full effect.
There you go. The shameless plug has been given. All right, come to the end of our show today. Hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Social Justice Forum. Now, if you're rewatching this week's edition, Recablecast right here on BronxNet.org. And of course, if you want to join the conversation and present your point of view, do that. Visit our social media at BronxNet TV. Join us next week. We continue to elevate the discussion and bring further awareness across the globe. I am Daren Jaime, your host, saying take care and God bless.